The phone rang 3 times before my mother picked it up, and by the time she said hello, her hand was already shaking. She told me that part later, after everything, when we could finally laugh about how close she came to hanging up on the United States Navy. It was a Tuesday night at the Brackwater Inn, the kind of slow, rain-streaked evening, where the only sound, besides the wind, was Fern Applegate running a dustcloth over the same banister she'd polished 100 times before. My mother, Opaline Kingsolver, was behind the front desk sorting receipts when the old Rotorice-style landline, the one we kept for guests who still didn't trust cell service on the coast, rang out into the empty lobby. "Brackwater Inn," she answered, the way she'd answered that phone for 31 years. A woman's voice came back crisp and formal, the kind of voice that had given 1,000 orders and expected them followed. "Ma'am, this is Captain Beatrix Sorrell, United States Navy. I'm calling regarding Commander Kingsolver." My mother told me she looked around the lobby first. Like the caller might be talking about someone standing behind her, someone she hadn't noticed come in. There was no Commander Kingsolver in our family. There was Wendell Kingsolver, my father, who'd run this inn since he was 26. There was Isadora, my younger sister, who told anyone who'd listen that she was the one who'd sacrificed her 20s to keep this place standing. And there was me, Marlowe, who everyone at that inn had spent a decade describing as the daughter who ran off to play sailor instead of helping with the family business. "I'm sorry," my mother said. "I think you might have the wrong number. Is this the residence listed for Lieutenant Commander Marlowe Kingsolver?" The line went quiet on my mother's end. She has told me, more than once, because I think saying it out loud helps her live with the years before it, that in that silence, she genuinely could not place who the Navy could possibly mean. That was the moment my sister wandered over from the parlor, drying her hands on a dish towel, drawn by the change in our mother's voice. Isadora heard Commander and Kingsolver in the same breath, and her first instinct, before curiosity, before fear, before anything resembling concern, was irritation. "It's probably a scam," Isadora said, loud enough for my mother to hear over the receiver, not even bothering to lower her voice for the stranger listening on the other end. "Tell them we don't have money for whatever they're selling." I wasn't there for any of this. I was 300 miles offshore in 22-foot swells with a fractured collarbone and a flooding compartment, which is its own story, and I'll get to it. But I've heard the landline story enough times now, from my mother, from Fern, even once, grudgingly, from my father, that I can walk through it like I lived it. Captain Sorrell didn't waver. She'd made calls like this before, and she knew exactly how to cut through a family that didn't yet understand what was happening. "Ma'am, I need to speak with a listed next of kin. There's been an incident at sea involving Commander Kingsolver's vessel. For 10 years, my family had a very specific version of who I was. I was the daughter who left. The one who ran off to do busy work in the military, instead of staying to help my parents keep the inn afloat. While Isadora, according to Isadora, was the one who stayed and sacrificed and built something real." That story got repeated at every holiday table, every guest breakfast where a relative asked what I did for a living and got a dismissive wave in response. Nobody in that dining room had ever asked what rank I held. Nobody had ever needed to, because nobody believed there was anything to ask about. That's the strange thing about a decade of being underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best. It doesn't announce itself as cruelty. It just accumulates, one shrug at a time, one dismissed comment at a time, until it's simply the water everyone swims in, invisible to everyone but the person drowning quietly in it. I should tell you, before we go further, that there's a brass plaque bolted beside the Brackwater's front door. My great-grandfather put it up in 1957 when he built the place. A small wooden board underneath it, hand-lettered, listing each generation of Kingsolvers and a single line about what they'd done with their lives. My father's line reads Wendell Kingsolver, innkeeper, 1979 to present. My sister insisted on adding her own line the year she turned 30. Isadora Kingsolver Thatch, keeper of the family legacy. My line, added by my mother back when I first enlisted and never updated since, just says Marlowe Kingsolver, away in service, vague, unfinished. The kind of sentence you write when you don't actually know what to say about someone. I used to walk past that board every time I came home on leave and think, someday that line is going to say something true. I didn't know yet how true, or how soon, or how much it was going to cost me to get there. My mother's hand tightened on the phone. What kind of incident? I'd prefer to explain the full situation once I have you and your husband together, ma'am. Is Mr. Kingsolver available? Here's something I need you to sit with for a second, because it's the exact question at the center of everything that follows. If a stranger called your family tonight and told you that the person you'd spent 10 years dismissing was actually someone they'd never bothered to find out about, would you believe it on the spot? Comment Y if yes. Comment N if no. I'll tell you the truth by the end. My mother set the phone down on the counter, cupped her hand over the receiver, and called toward the kitchen where my father was going over the week's linen order. Wendell, Navy's on the phone. Something about Marlowe. My father came out wiping his hands on his apron, already half annoyed at the interruption, the way he got annoyed at anything that pulled him from a spreadsheet. What now? They keep calling her Commander. He actually laughed. One short, disbelieving syllable. Commander of what? I think that laugh is the moment my mother has replayed most in the month since. Not out of guilt exactly. My father is not a cruel man, and neither is she. But because it captures, in a single breath, exactly how far off the rails the story of me had gotten in that house. My father genuinely believed, at 59 years old, standing in the inn he'd spent his life building, that his older daughter held some vague, unranked position doing what he liked to call odd jobs for the government. He believed it because it was easier than asking, easier than updating a wooden plaque, easier than looking past the version of me that let him feel good about the version of Isadora he'd chosen to believe in instead. Captain Sorrel, waiting patiently on the other end of a phone line held by two people who did not yet understand who they were talking to, said the words that finally landed. Sir, ma'am. Commander Kingsolver is the commanding officer of USS Cormorant, a mine countermeasures vessel currently operating out of Naval Station Corvina Bay. Her ship encountered severe weather and mechanical failure roughly 11 hours ago. She has sustained injuries that are not life-threatening, but as her listed emergency contacts, you're entitled to a full briefing. My mother told me she had to sit down on the stool behind the desk at that point, because her legs had simply stopped feeling steady enough to trust. Commanding officer, she repeated, like the phrase needed to be said out loud to become real, of a ship. Yes, ma'am. Commander Kingsolver has held command of Cormorant for 11 months. Prior to that, she served as executive officer aboard USS Falconer for 2 years and completed a division officer tour aboard USS Halloway before that. I have her full service record in front of me, if it would help to have some of that context. There was no impatience in Sorrel's voice, no judgment either, just the flat, practiced patience of a woman who had clearly made calls like this before to families who had clearly not known what they should have. My father, still holding the receiver at arm's length like it might do something unpredictable, finally asked the question that had been sitting underneath all his disbelief. How long has she been a commander? A commanding officer, I mean. 11 months in this specific command, sir. She made commander 2 years ago after 16 years of service. A pause, brief but deliberate. I'd imagine that's information you already had given the timeline. But I understand emergency calls aren't always the moment families have the fullest picture. That last sentence, delivered without a trace of accusation, somehow landed harder than anything sharper could have. Sorrel wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. She was simply doing her job, reading facts off a service record to people who, it was becoming clear even to her, had never once asked to see it. For the first time in a decade, the word commander hung in that lobby completely unchallenged. 11 hours earlier, on the open water, none of that mattered to me at all. What mattered was a bilge alarm screaming through a compartment that was taking on water faster than the pumps could clear it, and 41 people under my command, whose lives were, in that particular moment, entirely my responsibility. We'd been running a routine mine-clearing exercise off the coast, when a low-pressure system that wasn't supposed to reach us until the following morning arrived 9 hours early and considerably angrier than forecast. 22-foot swells don't sound like much until you're on a 500-foot fiberglass-hulled minesweeper built specifically not to attract magnetic ordnance, which also means built specifically not to be reassuring in heavy seas. Cormorant rolled hard to starboard, took a wave over the bow that buckled a hatch seal on the forward compartment, and within 4 minutes we had 11 inches of water rising and climbing. I was in the passageway heading toward the flooding compartment when Petty Officer Second Class Des Okafor went down hard, catching his leg between a support strut and a piece of shifting deck plating. I got him clear, got the damage control team moving, and in the process of hauling a collision mat into position against the breach, a swell threw the ship hard enough that I came down wrong across a steel ladder rail. I heard the crack before I felt it. Collarbone. I kept working anyway, because there is no version of that night where I get to stop and check on myself while my ship is flooding, and one of my sailors is already down. We got the breach contained. We got Okafor stabilized. We got Cormorant back under control roughly 90 minutes after the first wave hit, and I did not sit down, did not let anyone look at my shoulder until I'd confirmed every soul on that ship was accounted for and the vessel was no longer taking on water. Those 90 minutes are still, if I'm honest, the clearest I've ever thought in my life. There's a particular kind of focus that comes with a flooding compartment and 41 people depending on your next decision. Every non-essential thought simply falls away, and what's left is a narrow, absolute clarity about what has to happen next, and next, and next after that. I remember calling the flooding boundary report to the bridge with a voice that didn't shake at all, even though I could feel, distantly, that something in my shoulder was very wrong. I remember the exact moment the collision mat finally seated against the hull breach and held, the water pressure driving it flush instead of forcing it back, and the strange adrenaline-flattened relief of watching the bilge alarm's pitch finally start to drop. I remember Okafor, pale and sweating on a stretcher in the passageway, gripping my hand hard enough to bruise and asking if the compartment was going to hold, and telling him yes, because by then I knew it was true, and because even if I hadn't known, that was still the only answer I would have given him. It's strange, thinking back on it now, that the most purely, unambiguously me I have ever been, clear-headed, competent, entirely trusted by 41 people to make the right call under real pressure, happened in a compartment 300 miles from anyone who'd spent the last decade deciding I ran off to avoid responsibility. Nobody in that flooding passageway needed convincing of who I was. They just needed me to do the job, and I did it. The way I'd done it for 16 years, whether or not anyone back home was paying attention. It was well after that. Hours after, once we were steaming back toward Corvina Bay under our own power, and I finally let the corpsman splint, what turned out to be a clean fracture, that Captain Sorrell, reviewing the incident report and the standard next of kin notification protocol, pulled up my emergency contact information and found something that made her pause. The number on file was a decade out of date. Not wrong, exactly. It was still the Brackwater Inn's landline, still ringing through to the same lobby it always had. But nobody in that house had ever called me to update anything, because nobody had ever needed to reach me for anything more urgent than a birthday reminder. 10 years of deployments, promotions, commendations, and not one person on the other end of that number had thought to ask whether the details were still current. Because as far as they were concerned, there was nothing about my life significant enough to require updating. Captain Sorrell picked up the phone anyway. She made the call because it was protocol, because it was correct, because somewhere far from my father's dismissive laugh and my sister's reflexive scam accusation, there is a whole world that runs on the assumption that a commander's family deserves to know what happens to her. That was the night the story my family had told about me for 10 years started, very quietly, to come apart. I came home to the Brackwater 11 days later, arm bound in a sling, still moving like every step cost something. The inn looked exactly the way it always did in early autumn. String lights over the porch, the smell of Fern's cinnamon bread drifting from the kitchen, guests reading paperbacks in the wicker chairs that faced the water. What was different was the way my family looked at me when I walked through the door. My mother hugged me too carefully, like I might be made of something breakable in a way she hadn't considered before. My father stood a few feet back, arms crossed, studying me the way you study a stranger you've been told is actually someone you know. Nobody said the word commander out loud yet. It sat in the room instead, unspoken, recalibrating. Isadora was the one who broke the silence, because Isadora has never in her life been able to leave a silence alone. "Look at you," she said, crossing the lobby in that particular walk of hers. the one that always seemed choreographed for an audience even when there wasn't one. She reached out and touched the edge of my sling with 2 fingers, like she was checking whether it was real. So what happened, exactly? They finally give you a desk job to keep you safe. I want to be honest with you about something. I was exhausted. My shoulder was on fire under the brace. I had spent the last 11 days being debriefed, evaluated, and reassured by strangers that Petty Officer Okafor was going to make a full recovery, and I had not slept more than 4 hours in a stretch since the storm. I did not, in that moment, have it in me to correct my sister. I just said something like that, and let her believe whatever made her comfortable, because I'd learned a long time ago that correcting Isadora cost more energy than it was worth, and I didn't have any to spare. That's its own kind of exhaustion, by the way. Not the physical kind, but the specific tiredness of being underestimated by people who are supposed to be in your corner. You stop correcting the record because the correcting never actually lands. It just gets absorbed and reshaped into whatever story the room already prefers. I left for officer candidate school at 22, 3 weeks after my college graduation, and I remember exactly how my father reacted when I told him. Not angry, which would have almost been easier to argue with, just quietly, endlessly disappointed. Why, you'd be disappointed in a business decision you thought someone smarter should have known better than to make. The inn's going to need both of you eventually, he'd said, not really to me, more to the air, the way he talked when he'd already decided something and was just narrating his own certainty out loud. Isadora, 20 at the time, hadn't said much of anything. She'd stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and watched me pack, and I remember thinking, at the time, that she looked almost relieved. I understand now what I couldn't name then. That my leaving handed her something she badly wanted, which was an uncontested claim to being the daughter who stayed, the daughter who mattered, the daughter whose sacrifice nobody would ever get to measure against an alternative, because the alternative had removed herself from the comparison entirely. I went to officer candidate school instead of the Naval Academy. A detail I mention because it matters to how slowly my family's story about me calcified. There was no dramatic 4-year absence with a crisp graduation ceremony they could point to and say, there, that's when it got real. Just a series of quiet transitions. Commissioning. My first assignment aboard a frigate out of Norfolk's, a surface warfare qualification I earned after 18 months of exams and watch standing that nearly broke me. A lieutenant's bars that arrived in the mail with no fanfare because I was 6 weeks into a deployment when the promotion came through. Each of those milestones happened somewhere my family couldn't see them, and because they couldn't see them, they simply decided they hadn't happened at any meaningful scale. I'd come home on leave, and my mother would ask, gently, if I was still doing the same job, and I'd say yes, because by then it was easier than explaining that the job had changed 4 times since the last time she'd asked. By the time I made lieutenant commander, the milestone that, in a Navy career, usually marks the point where people start taking you seriously as someone bound for command, I'd stopped correcting anyone at all. I'd stopped bringing my orders home to show my father. I'd stopped mentioning commendations at the dinner table because I'd learned that mentioning them only ever produced the same response. A beat of polite silence, and then someone, usually Isadora, steering the conversation back toward the inn, back toward the renovation, back toward whatever she was building that the whole family could see with their own eyes and, therefore, believe in. I understand, looking back at it now, that I let that happen. I let the silence become the path of least resistance. I told myself it didn't matter what my family believed about my life, as long as the Navy believed in it enough to keep giving me more responsibility, more trust, more people to be accountable for. For a long time, that felt like enough. It stopped feeling like enough somewhere around the time I took command of Cormorant. The actual moment, the change of command ceremony on the pier at Corvina Bay, reading my orders aloud in front of my crew while a Navy band played, and my executive officer stood at my shoulder. I'd sent my parents an invitation. They didn't come. My father cited the inn's peak season booking calendar. My mother sent a card instead, warm and well-meaning, and completely unaware of what it actually was that she was missing. I stood on that pier and took command of a 500-foot ship and 41 sailors. And the family that had spent 2 decades deciding I ran off to play sailor wasn't there to seize the exact moment that stopped being a fair description of anything. Roman, my brother-in-law, offered a handshake instead of a hug, which told me everything about where he sat in this family's hierarchy of who mattered. He asked how long I'd be staying, in a tone that made it clear he already had an answer he preferred. Until my shoulder clears for full duty, I said. Doctors estimating 6 weeks. Something moved across his face when I said 6 weeks. I didn't clock it as anything at the time. I've thought about it since, and I think that was the exact moment Roman Thatch understood that his wife's 10-year story about her useless older sister was about to be tested by 6 weeks of that sister actually being in the house, with time on her hands and nothing to do but notice things. For the first week, I mostly slept and let my mother fuss over me and tried to get used to being back in a house that had gotten smaller and stranger in my absence. Isadora and Roman had renovated the East Wing 2 years earlier. New plumbing, a widened dining porch, 6 additional guest rooms, and everyone talked about it like it was a triumph, proof of exactly the kind of sacrifice and vision Isadora had always claimed for herself. Guests complimented it. My father mentioned it at every opportunity. Isadora saved this place, he told a table of tourists over breakfast one morning, not realizing I was in earshot on the stairs. If it weren't for her, we'd have lost it years ago. I didn't argue. I didn't have the numbers to argue with yet. I just filed it away. The way you file away a lot of things about people you love when you've decided, consciously or not, that peace is worth more than being right. There was a dinner that first Saturday, the kind the Brackwater hosted monthly for its longer-staying guests, a family-style spread in the newly widened dining porch that Isadora had spent 2 years describing as her proudest achievement. She played host, beautifully, I'll give her that. Refilling wine glasses, telling the story of the renovation to a table of 8 strangers with practiced warmth of someone who told it 100 times before. It nearly broke me, she said, laughing lightly, one hand resting on the porch railing like she was presenting a stage set. 2 years of contractors and permits and sleepless nights. But I couldn't let this place fall apart. It's been in our family since 1957. A guest, an older woman visiting from 3 states away for her 40th anniversary, turned to me at some point during dessert and asked, kindly, what I did for work. I told her, I served in the Navy, and she nodded politely in the way people do when they've already decided the answer doesn't require follow-up questions, and turned back to Isadora to ask about the porch furniture instead. I sat with my sling propped against my water glass and watched my sister accept 2 years of admiration for a project I now understood I had unknowingly financed a third of, and I said nothing, because I still didn't have the paperwork yet to say anything that would land. Roman, at the far end of the table, caught my eye once made during that dinner. A brief, unreadable look, gone almost as soon as it appeared. And I remember thinking, without quite knowing why, that of everyone at that table, he was the one person who seemed uncomfortable with how well the evening was going. The second week, my mother asked if I could help her go through the mail. It had piled up in the way mail piles up at a place like the Brackwater, guest correspondence, supplier invoices, county tax notices, all of it dumped into a wicker basket by the hall closet and sorted whenever someone had a spare hour, which at an 11-room inn with 2 full-time employees and 1 part-time groundskeeper was rarely. I sat on the floor of the hallway with my good arm and started sorting. Guest reviews into one pile, bills into another. And then, near the bottom of the basket, a thick manila envelope, addressed to me, Marlowe Kingsolver, at a street number in Corvina Bay I hadn't lived at in over 8 years, forwarded here by whoever now occupied that address, with a stack of similar envelopes rubber-banded behind it. I opened the top one first because I genuinely thought it was a mistake. A subscription renewal, maybe, or an old alumni mailing that had never updated its records. It was a monthly statement from Anchorline Commercial Bank, addressed to me, for a business line of credit in the amount of $42,200, 68 days delinquent, a late fee of $612 added to the balance that cycle alone. I don't have a business line of credit. I have never opened a business line of credit. I sat there on the hallway floor with my sling, digging into my collarbone, and read that number 4 times, waiting for it to rearrange itself into something that made sense. It didn't, so I opened the next envelope, and the one after that. 3 separate accounts, 3 separate account numbers, all opened under my legal name and my social security number, all tied, according to the loan purpose field on the second statement, to renovation and capital improvement. East Wing. The same East Wings everyone in this house had spent 2 years praising my sister for. I sat with that for a long time before I said anything to anyone. Partly because I needed to be certain I wasn't misreading it, partly because some small, stubborn part of me still wanted there to be an explanation that didn't require me to accept what the paperwork was already telling me, that someone in this house had used my name to build the very thing my family credited to Isadora's sacrifice, and had done it while I was thousands of miles offshore. Unable to notice, unable to object, unable to do anything but keep serving a country that, unlike my own family, had never once needed convincing that I was who I said I was. I found Fern in the kitchen the next morning, kneading dough with the particular ferocity of a woman who's been doing the same motion for 22 years and has stopped needing to think about it. Fern Applegate had worked at the Brackwater since before I enlisted. She'd bandaged my knees as a kid, covered for me the summer I snuck out to a concert 2 towns over, and never once, in all my years of coming and going, treated my absence like a betrayal the way the rest of my family did. Fern, I said, can I ask you something? And can you actually answer it honestly? She stopped kneading. Something in my voice must have told her this wasn't going to be a small question. I found some bank statements, I said, in my name, for loans I never took out. Fern's hands went still on the dough, and for a moment she didn't say anything at all, which told me more than any answer could have. I wondered when someone was finally going to find those, she said quietly. I asked her what she meant, and she told me, reluctantly, in the halting way of someone who spent a long time deciding silence was safer than honesty. 2 years earlier, late one night when she was locking up after a wedding party in the function room, she'd walked past the inn's little office and seen Isadora at the desk, bent over a stack of papers, signing something with quick, practiced strokes. I made some comment, Fern said. Joked that she must have a lot of paperwork to catch up on, and she laughed. Not a nice laugh, more like she was pleased with herself, and said something like, I've gotten pretty good at doing Marlowe's signature. 10 years of birthday cards will do that. I asked Fern why she never said anything. Because I told myself it was nothing, she said, and her voice cracked in a way I'd never heard from her before, not even the year her husband passed. I told myself maybe you two had some arrangement I didn't know about. Sisters share things. I didn't want to be the housekeeper who accused the family's daughter of something that wasn't my business. She wiped her hands on her apron, though there was no dough on them anymore, just something she needed her hands to do. And then I started seeing the statements come through the mail, month after month, unopened, addressed to an address that wasn't even yours anymore, and I understood exactly what I'd let myself look away from. I'm sorry, Marlowe. I should have said something the first night. I told her it wasn't her fault, because it wasn't. The fault belonged entirely to 2 people who were, at that very moment, 3 rooms away, hosting a wine tasting for a party of 8 and accepting compliments on the beautiful renovation they'd built on the back of my credit and my absence. Fern reached over and squeezed my good hand, hard, before I left the kitchen. For what it's worth, she said, I never once believed that story they told about you. Not really. I just didn't have anything to put in its place. So I stayed quiet, and I let their version be the loudest one in the room. I won't do that again. But I also understood, sitting in that kitchen with a housekeeper's guilt hanging in the air between us, that the machinery of this had been running for a long time, in plain sight, and that everyone in this house had found their own quiet reason not to look at it directly. I wasn't going to have that luxury anymore. That night, once the inn had gone quiet, and the last guest had padded upstairs, I sat on the porch steps with my sling propped against the railing and called Lieutenant Priya Deshmukh, my executive officer, ostensibly to check on Cormorant's repair timeline and Petty Officer Okafor's recovery, though I think we both knew that wasn't really why I'd called. He's doing well, Priya said. Still on crutches, still complaining about the physical therapist, which the corpsman assures me is a good sign. He asked me to tell you he's annoyed you got hurt worse than he did and still won't admit it hurts. I laughed, and it felt strange in my chest, like a muscle I hadn't used in days. I told her, in pieces, what I'd found in the hall closet, what Fern had confirmed in the kitchen. Priya had served under me for 2 years by then, long enough that she didn't offer platitudes. She just listened, and at the end of it, she said the thing I think I'd actually called to hear. "You know that none of that has anything to do with who you are on this ship," she said. 41 people trust you with their lives every time we get underway. That's not a story anyone gets to rewrite from a kitchen table 300 miles away. I sat with the phone against my ear long after we'd said goodnight, looking out at the dark water past the porch rail. The same water my family had spent a decade insisting I'd run away from instead of toward. I thought about how strange it was that the version of me my parents had built, dismissive, vague, unranked, away in service, had never once had to survive contact with the actual facts of my life. Because nobody in that house had ever gone looking for them. It's a particular kind of loneliness, being loved by people who've simply decided not to know you. Not unloved, just unknown, in a way that starts to feel, after enough years, almost indistinguishable from the same thing. I didn't cry that night, though I came close somewhere around midnight, sitting alone on those steps with the smell of the tide coming in and Fern's confession still ringing in my ears. What I felt instead, underneath the hurt, was something colder and more useful, a kind of clarity. I wasn't going to spend the next however many years quietly absorbing a story that wasn't true. I was going to find out exactly how deep it went, and then I was going to make sure the truth was the only version left standing. I waited until the last guests had gone up for the night before I laid the statements out on the dining room table. All 14 of them, arranged by account and by date. The delinquency notices on top where they couldn't be missed. Then I asked my parents, Isadora and Roman, to sit down. My father assumed it was some kind of Navy paperwork issue at first, something bureaucratic and boring. He actually reached for his reading glasses like he was preparing to help me fill out a form. It took Isadora considerably less time to understand what she was looking at, and even less time than that to decide how she was going to play it. "Oh," she said, scanning the top statement, her voice light in a way that felt rehearsed. "Those. Yeah, I probably should have mentioned those. You should have mentioned 3 business loans totaling over 100,000 taken out in my name. It's not that dramatic." She waved a hand, the same gesture our father used when he wanted a conversation to be smaller than it was. "Your credit was just easier to use while you were deployed. Mine was already stretched thin from the first round of renovations, and the bank practically laughed me out of the branch when I tried for a 4th line under my own name. It's not like I was going to let you find out and be blindsided. We always planned to have it paid off before it ever became your problem. You forged my signature. I matched your signature," she said, like the distinction mattered. Like there was a version of this where borrowing someone's identity without asking was a technicality rather than a crime. "It's a formality, Marlowe. You weren't even using your own credit for anything. You were 3 states away playing sailor half the year. What was it supposed to do, just sit there?" That phrase, playing sailor, landed the way it always landed, except this time it landed on top of $42,000 in delinquent debt with my name on it, and something in me that had absorbed that particular insult quietly for a decade simply stopped absorbing it. Roman, to his credit, or maybe to his detriment, is not as practiced a liar as his wife. He'd been quiet through all of it, jaw tight, and when he finally spoke, what came out wasn't a defense. It was a confession dressed up as one. "We always intended to pay it off before you found out," he said. "That was the whole plan. Nobody was trying to hurt you. Before you found out. Not before it came due. Not before it affected me. Before I found out." My own brother-in-law had just confirmed, in front of my parents, that the entire strategy here had never been an oversight or a favor gone sideways. It had been a bet, placed against the odds that I would never come home long enough, or look closely enough, to notice that my name had been quietly rented out to fund a life I wasn't living. My mother's face had gone pale. My father had taken his reading glasses off and was turning them over in his hands, over and over, the way he does when he's trying to make a fact sit still long enough to be believed. I didn't yell. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect the confrontation scene to be loud, and mine wasn't. I gathered the statements back into their stack, squared the edges against the table the way you'd square a deck of cards, and said, "I'm going to need copies of everything, all of it. Every statement, every account, every renovation invoice tied to these funds. For what? Isadora asked, and there was the first real note of fear I'd heard in her voice all night. Because I'm going to find out exactly how deep this goes, I said. And then I'm going to fix it. My father found his voice then, though it came out smaller than I'd ever heard it. Isadora, tell me this isn't what it looks like. She didn't answer him. That, more than anything she'd said up to that point, told him everything. I watched something shift in my father's face. Not anger yet, that would come later, but the particular collapse of a man realizing that a story he'd built his last 2 years of pride around had a hole in the foundation he'd never once thought to check. He'd told the Hendersons and the Palmers and half the guests who'd ever sat at his breakfast table that Isadora had single-handedly kept this place alive. He'd said it in front of me more than once, without ever imagining I might someday have the paperwork to prove otherwise. My mother reached for my hand across the table the first time she'd touched me since I'd laid the statements out. "How long have you known?" she asked, and I understood she wasn't asking about the statements. She was asking how long I'd been quietly carrying doubts about her golden daughter's version of events and saying nothing the same way she had. "Since yesterday," I said. "I found the envelopes in the hall closet. And before that?" Her eyes searched mine, looking, I think, for some reassurance that this had come out of nowhere, that none of us had been complicit in looking away. I didn't have that reassurance to give her. I only had the truth, which was that none of us had looked closely enough, for reasons that were different for each of us but added up to the same silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my childhood bedroom with the statements spread across the bed and a legal pad I'd found in the office, trying to reconstruct a timeline with a broken collarbone slowing down every page I turned. By morning, I'd made a decision. I called Anson Vale. I'd met Anson years earlier briefly at a fundraiser for a veterans housing initiative. He did forensic financial work for a firm 2 towns over, the kind of quiet, meticulous man who noticed things other people's eyes slid right past. I told him what I'd found. He told me to bring everything. His office smelled like coffee and old paper, and he laid my 14 statements out on a light table like he was examining evidence at a crime scene, which, as it turned out, he was. "Give me a week," he said. "I want to pull the original loan applications, not just the statements. Signatures, notarizations, everything." It took him 4 days, not a week, and when he called me back into his office, he had a folder thick enough that I felt my stomach drop before he'd said a single word. "3 separate lines of credit," he said, sliding the folder across the desk. "Opened over an 8-year period. First one in the amount of $25,000, second at $51,000, third at $42,200. All under your legal name, your social security number, and this is the part I want you to look at closely, all signed." He pulled out 3 signature pages, laid them side by side, and slid a magnifying loupe across the table. "Look at the pressure points, the pen lifts. Your actual signature, I pulled a sample from your Navy personnel file, with your permission on file from our intake form, has a consistent lift after the K in Kingsolver every single time, because that's a habit, not a choice. Muscle memory. These 3 signatures," he tapped each one in turn, "get progressively better at faking that lift. The first one misses it entirely. The third one nearly nails it." "Someone practiced," I said. "Someone practiced for 8 years," Anson said. "This isn't a single impulsive forgery, Marlowe. This is a sustained, evolving pattern by someone who had ongoing, unsupervised access to your signature and enough time between each application to refine the forgery based on what worked before." I sat with that for a long moment, and this is the part I need you to understand, because it's the part that changed everything for me. Up until that meeting, some quiet corner of my mind had still been holding space for an explanation that made this smaller. A single bad decision, a moment of panic, a one-time betrayal born out of desperation. What Anson laid out on that table wasn't a moment. It was a decade-long infrastructure, built patiently, refined with practice, hidden in plain sight behind unopened envelopes, and a story about who I was that made sure nobody in that house would ever think to check. I had believed, walking into that office, that I already understood how far my sister was willing to go to build her version of this family's story. Sitting across from Anson Vale with 3 forged signatures under a magnifying loupe, I realized I wasn't even close to the bottom of it yet. Anson wasn't finished. He pulled a second folder from beneath the first, this one thinner, and slid it across the desk with the careful precision of a man who'd learned long ago not to editorialize his own findings. I also traced the disbursements, he said, where the money actually went once each line of credit funded. He walked me through it line by line. The first loan, the $25,000 one, had gone almost entirely toward a contractor's deposit for the East Wing plumbing overhaul, verifiable at least as in-related. The second, $51,000, split roughly 60-40 between the renovation and a payment described in the bank's memo field only as RT, consulting, which Anson flagged with a small red tab. The third, $42,200, showed a similar pattern, a portion toward the widened porch, and a portion that moved, within 9 days of disbursement, into a personal checking account that did not belong to the inn's business entity at all. Whose account? I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer. Roman Thatch's individual account, Anson said. A little over $16,000 across both later loans, disbursed within days of each funding date, memoed only as consulting fees with no invoice on file that I could locate. I'm not a prosecutor, Marlowe, so I won't tell you what that means legally. But as a forensic matter, it tells you the renovation wasn't the only thing this money was funding. That detail sat differently than the forgery itself had. The forgery, awful as it was, at least fit inside a story I could almost understand. A sister convincing herself she was owed something, taking a shortcut she'd talked herself into believing was fair. $16,000 quietly siphoned into her husband's personal account under a vague label was something else entirely. It meant the justification Isadora had been rehearsing in her head for a decade. I built something real, I sacrificed, I earned it. Had never been the whole truth even by her own logic, because a meaningful share of what she'd taken hadn't gone toward the inn at all. I asked Anson, before I left his office that afternoon, whether he'd seen cases like this before. A decade of quiet, escalating fraud hidden inside a family that never once thought to check on itself. He considered the question longer than I expected. More than you'd think, he said finally. The pattern's almost always the same. It only works because somebody nearby decides not to look. Not out of malice usually, just habit. Trust that never gets tested is the easiest thing in the world to exploit, precisely because nobody's watching for it. I took Anson's findings to Rosalind Fenwick the following week. She'd handled a maritime property dispute for a fellow officer years back, and her name had stayed in the back of my mind the way a good referral does. Her office overlooked the harbor, and she read through the folder twice before she said a word, which told me she took it seriously. Here's what I need you to understand, she said finally, folding her hands on the desk. This isn't just a family financial mess you're going to quietly sort out over Thanksgiving. This is identity fraud. Federal identity fraud, given the interstate banking involved, and depending on how the bank's fraud department classifies it, likely wire fraud on top of that. I don't want to destroy my sister's life over this, I said, and I meant it even then. I understand that, Rosalind said. I'd ask you to hold that feeling for a moment, though, and let me walk you through what your options actually are, because I don't think you've fully weighed them yet. She laid out 3 paths on a legal pad as she spoke: a quiet, private resolution, where Isadora and Roman simply repaid the money with no formal record anywhere; a civil suit, which would recover the funds but wouldn't necessarily establish fraud in any way that mattered to my clearance file; and a criminal referral, filed jointly with the bank's own fraud investigators, which was slower, more public, and considerably harder to undo once set in motion. Most people in your position want option 1, she said. It's the path of least damage to the family. I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't tell you plainly that it's also the path most likely to leave your own record still carrying risk, because a private repayment doesn't generate the kind of documented finding a security clearance review actually wants to see. But I need you to understand something too. You hold a security clearance. Your career depends on a clean financial and legal record. That's not optional for someone in your position. It's foundational. Right now, there are 3 delinquent accounts under your name showing up in credit checks that could be pulled during your next clearance renewal. If this isn't resolved formally on paper with a documented finding of fraud, it doesn't just sit there as your sister's problem, it becomes yours. It could jeopardize the command you fought for years to earn. That was the sentence that reframed everything for me. This had never just been about money, or about a decade of being underestimated at the family dinner table. Isadora's decision to use my identity had quietly built a fault line under the one part of my life that had never once required anyone's belief in me to be real. My career, my rank, the thing I'd earned entirely on my own, 300 miles from anyone who doubted me. The clock is running against you, Rosalind said, not dramatically, but it is running. I'd recommend we move on this formally within the next 2 weeks. I drove back to the Brackwater that evening, with the folder on the passenger seat and the plaque by the front door sitting in my mind the way it always did lately, Marlowe Kingsolver away in service, and I thought, for the first time with real clarity, that the line wasn't just outdated. It had been protecting someone. Just not me. I sat my father down alone the next morning, before the breakfast rush, in the little office off the lobby where he kept the inn's ledgers going back 30 years. I put Anson's report in front of him, along with a printout of the East Wing renovation invoices Rosalind's paralegal had pulled from the contractor's records. I want you to do something for me, I said. Cross-reference these renovation costs against the business's own accounts, not against anything with my name on it. Just the inn's books, the way you've always kept them. My father is many things, but he is not careless with numbers. He's balanced this inn's books by hand for 3 decades out of a stubborn distrust of software he's never fully explained. He put his glasses on, pulled out the ledger for the renovation years, and started working through it the way he works through everything. Slowly, methodically, out loud sometimes without realizing it. I sat across from him and watched him work, and I understood, in a way I hadn't quite let myself before, how much of my father's confidence in Isadora had never actually been about her competence at all. It had been about relief, the simple human relief of a tired man in his late 50s being told, over and over, that he didn't need to worry about the thing he was most afraid of, which was losing the only life's work he'd ever had. Isadora hadn't just claimed credit for saving the inn. She'd offered him permission to stop carrying that particular fear, and he'd taken it gratefully the way anyone would, without asking too closely what the offer actually cost. It took him 40 minutes to find what I already suspected he'd find. The business's own capital account had covered maybe a third of the East Wing's total cost. The rest, the plumbing overhaul, the widened porch, 6 new guest rooms worth of fixtures and furniture, had no corresponding source, no loan under the inn's business name, no infusion from savings. Just a gap, year over year, that the books had never explained because nobody had ever asked them to. This doesn't add up, he said, more to himself than to me, running his finger down a column for the 3rd time, like the numbers might rearrange themselves into something less uncomfortable. The East Wing cost the business, $141,000, all told. I only ever see 39 of that leave our own accounts. That's because the rest came out of accounts under my name, I said quietly. 3 lines of credit, forged. I have the forensic report if you want to see it. I watched my father do something I hadn't seen him do in years. Sit perfectly still, jaw working, while a version of the world he'd been comfortable in for 2 years quietly dissolved. He'd told strangers at his own breakfast table that Isadora had saved this place. He'd said it with pride. He'd said it, I now understood, because believing that story let him avoid a harder question. Where had the money actually come from, and why had he never once asked? He found Isadora in the kitchen an hour later, plating scones for the morning guests like nothing in the world had changed. I stood in the doorway because this was his confrontation to have, not mine, and I think some part of me needed to see whether my father, at least, was capable of it. Whose name did you use, he said, and his voice cracked in a way I had genuinely never heard from him, not once in 39 years, when the business couldn't cover it. Isadora's hands went still over the scones. Dad. Don't, he said. I already know, I want to hear you say it. She didn't say it, not directly. What she said instead, and I remember this almost word for word because it told me everything about how she'd rationalized a decade of this, was, I built something real here, I stayed. I gave up my 20s to keep this place from falling apart while Marlowe was off doing whatever it is she does. You're going to stand there and act like I'm the villain because I used a resource that was just sitting there unused? She wasn't even here. She didn't need it. I did. You needed my identity, I said, stepping into the kitchen, unable to stay in the doorway any longer. Not a resource, Isadora. A person. My name, my social security number, my credit, my career. All of it treated like something you were entitled to borrow because I wasn't in the room to say no. You were never in the room, she snapped back, and there it was. The truest sentence she'd said in this entire conversation, delivered like an accusation when it was actually a confession. That's the whole problem. You were never here, and everyone acted like that made you the hero and me, the one who had to give everything up. I got tired of being the only king solver who actually showed up. I understood in that moment something about my sister I hadn't fully let myself see before. This wasn't only about money. It was about a decade of resentment that had curdled into something she'd convinced herself was justice. A private ledger she'd kept in her head where every year I spent away accrued a debt she believed I owed her, one she felt entitled to collect however she saw fit, regardless of whether I'd agreed to owe it. There was one more thing I needed to say before this conversation went any further, and I said it looking directly at Roman rather than my sister. $16,000 of that money went into your personal account, Roman. Not the inn's. Yours. Consulting fees, the memo says. Though nobody's been able to produce a single invoice for whatever it is you were consulting on. Nope, Roman's face did something complicated. A flicker of panic quickly smoothed back into practiced calm, the expression of a man who'd been rehearsing an answer for exactly this question for longer than he wanted anyone to know. That was reimbursement, he said, for time I put into managing the renovation, overseeing contractors, that kind of thing. Show me the contract, I said. Show me anything that says the inn agreed to pay you a consulting fee for overseeing your own home renovation. He didn't have anything to show me because there wasn't anything to show. Isadora looked at him then, and for the first time all evening, the crack in her composure wasn't about me at all. It was about him, about the sudden sinking realization that whatever story she'd told herself about sacrifice and building something real had apparently included her husband quietly skimming a piece of it for himself the entire time, without her ever asking too many questions about where exactly $16,000 had gone. It was a small, ugly moment watching two people who'd spent a decade united against me discover, in real time, that they hadn't been entirely honest with each other either. That was the moment the front door chimed. The same brass bell that had announced every guest, every delivery, every returning family member for 68 years. And Detective Corwin Blake walked into the Brackwaters kitchen in a plain gray suit, flanked by a uniformed officer, holding a folder of his own. Isadora Kingsolverthatch, he said, and it wasn't really a question. I'm Detective Corwin Blake, Financial Crimes Unit. I have a formal notice of investigation to deliver regarding multiple counts of identity fraud and forged financial instruments. He looked at the scones cooling on the counter, the domestic ordinariness of the scene, with the flat professionalism of a man who'd delivered this exact speech in 100 kitchens before. You have the right to have an attorney present for any statement you'd like to make. Isadora's justification, I got tired of being the only Kingsolver who actually showed up, was still hanging in the air when Blake set the folder down on the counter, and I watched every word of it curdle from a defense into evidence, read back to her in the flattest possible terms by a man whose job was not to care whether her reasons felt fair to her. Blake didn't make an arrest that day. The notice was a formal step in an ongoing investigation, not a takedown, and he explained as much in the same flat, procedural tone he used for everything else, before leaving a card on the counter and telling Isadora her attorney should contact his office within the week. But the kitchen didn't return to normal once he'd gone. It couldn't. My mother stood by the sink with her hand pressed flat against her chest, the way she does when she's trying to keep something inside her from coming apart, and my father sat down heavily in one of the breakfast chairs like his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him. 31 years, my mother said quietly, to no one in particular. I've run this front desk for 31 years and I never once thought to ask where the money for that wing actually came from. She looked at me, and there was something in her face I hadn't seen directed at me before. Not doubt, not the careful skepticism she usually wore when the subject of my career came up, but something closer to grief. I told people you ran off. I told the Hendersons that at breakfast just last month. I told them you'd left us to do it all ourselves. Her voice cracked. I'm so sorry, Marlo. I don't know how I let that become the story. I didn't have a clean answer for her in that moment, and I don't think she needed one. What she needed was to say it out loud, the way my father had needed to hear Isadora admit what she'd done, rather than simply knowing it privately. There's a difference between understanding something has gone wrong and actually saying so out loud, in the room where it happened, and I think my mother spent the rest of that afternoon in the lobby, seating guests and answering the phone with a kind of careful, deliberate attention, as if the ordinary motions of her job were the only thing steady enough to hold on to. Isadora didn't come out of her room for 2 days. Roman spent most of that time on the phone with an attorney his firm had recommended, pacing the gravel lot behind the inn with his free hand jammed in his pocket. And I noticed, with an emotion I couldn't fully name, that not one of those calls seemed to be to check on his wife. My father moved through the following week like a man auditing his entire life, pulling ledgers from a decade back, cross-referencing dates against memories, trying to locate the exact moment he'd stopped asking questions he should have kept asking. I didn't envy him that work. I think, in some ways, it was harder than mine. The weeks that followed moved with a kind of grinding, procedural momentum that felt almost anticlimactic after the intensity of that kitchen. Anson's forensic analysis went to the bank's fraud department, which independently confirmed all 3 lines of credit had been opened without my authorization. Fern gave a formal statement about what she'd witnessed 2 years earlier, her guilt finally converted into something useful. Blake's investigation, built on documentation solid enough that there was very little left to dispute, moved steadily toward formal charges: identity theft, forgery, and, given the interstate nature of the transactions, wire fraud. Blake called me twice during those weeks, mostly to walk through timeline questions, confirming dates I'd been deployed, cross-checking them against the loan application dates to establish that I couldn't possibly have signed the documents myself. It's the strongest kind of evidence there is. In a case like this, he told me during the second call, we don't just have a forensic opinion on the signatures. We have your ship's deployment log putting you in the middle of the Atlantic on the exact day 2 of these applications were notarized. That's not a coincidence a jury has to be convinced of. That's just a fact. He also confirmed, quietly, that his office had subpoenaed Roman's personal banking records after I'd flagged the consulting fee payments Anson had traced, and that the pattern held up under scrutiny. $16,180 moved into Roman's individual account across 2 disbursements, with no invoice, no contract, and no corresponding work product anywhere in the renovations paper trail. Somewhere in the middle of that process, Rosalind called me into her office with an offer on the table. The Thatch's attorney has proposed a private settlement, she said. Full restitution quietly, no formal charges, contingent on you declining to pursue the criminal complaint. It would be faster, cleaner, in a lot of ways, and it would keep this out of the local paper if that matters to you. I thought about it for exactly as long as it took her to finish the sentence, and then I told her no. Can I ask why, she said, not pushing back, just genuinely curious. Because if I let this disappear quietly, I said, the story that survives isn't the true one. It's the version where Isadora made a mistake and I was gracious enough to let it go. And somewhere down the line, whether it's her, or someone else in this family or in some other family entirely, somebody is going to be underestimated so completely that nobody thinks to check whether the story being told about them is even true. I'm not doing this because I want to punish my sister. I'm doing it because hiding what happened would mean the next person this happens to might never be believed either. Rosalind nodded slowly, like that was the answer she'd been hoping for without quite letting herself expect it. Then we proceed. She gathered the settlement letter from her desk and set it face down in a drawer, the way you'd put away something you no longer needed to consider. For what it's worth, Commander, most people don't choose the harder road when the easier one is sitting right in front of them, fully paid for. I don't think that says what you're afraid it says about your sister. I think it says something else entirely about you. The case took 4 months to resolve, longer than any of us expected, mostly because Roma's attorney kept trying to argue that his client had been an unwitting beneficiary rather than a knowing participant, right up until Blake produced a string of emails between Roman and a contractor discussing the financing coming through under Marlowe's name in language too specific to read any other way. In the end, both Isadora and Roman pleaded to reduce charges. Identity fraud forgery, with the wire fraud counts dropped in exchange for full cooperation and a restitution agreement. Isadora received 3 years of probation and 400 hours of community service, the bulk of which the court assigned to a local financial literacy program for seniors, a detail I found almost unbearably ironic given what had brought her there. Then, Roman received a similar sentence along with a 5-year ban from serving as an officer or signatory on any business banking account, a detail Rosalind told me the judge added specifically because of the pattern of financial control he'd exercised over Isadora's decisions throughout the scheme. The restitution order required them to repay the full $118,000, plus accrued interest and legal fees, directly to the accounts under my name, which meant that within 6 weeks of the sentencing, Anchorline Commercial Bank confirmed all 3 lines of credit closed, zeroed out, and formally cleared of delinquency. I was there for the sentencing, in my dress uniform, because Rosalind thought it would matter to the judge that this wasn't an abstraction, that there was an actual commanding officer standing in that courtroom whose actual clearance, actual career, and actual crew had been placed at risk by 2 people's decade of quiet theft. Isadora didn't look at me once during the proceedings. She stared straight ahead at the judge's bench, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. And when the judge read out the restitution figure, $118,000, plus $9,400 in accrued interest and legal costs, she flinched like she was hearing it for the first time, though of course she wasn't. My father sat 2 rows behind the defense table, alone, because my mother had told him gently that morning she didn't think she could sit in a room and watch her younger daughter be sentenced. Not yet, not with the wound still this fresh. He came to my apartment afterward, not the inn, which struck me as significant, as if some part of him needed neutral ground to say what he said next. I spent 30 years teaching both of you that this family runs on trust, he said, sitting at my kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he never drank. I think what I actually taught you both was that trust means never checking. That's not the same thing, Marlowe. I got that wrong for a very long time, and I don't know how to fix 30 years of it in an afternoon. I told him he didn't have to fix it in an afternoon. I told him showing up, actually showing up, to ask the hard questions from now on would be enough. I'm not sure either of us fully believed that in the moment, but I've watched him try, in the months since, reviewing every ledger line himself now, asking Fern directly rather than assuming, calling me before making any decision that touches the inn's finances instead of after. It's not absolution. It's just effort. Sustained past the point where it would have been easier to stop, and I've come to think that's most of what repair actually looks like between people who've hurt each other this badly. I sent that confirmation letter to my command the same week I received it. Rosalind had been right to worry. During a routine review, 2 months earlier, a preliminary financial flag had already been noted in my file, exactly the kind of thing that could have complicated a promotion board or a clearance renewal if it had been allowed to sit unresolved. Instead, the flag closed with a formal notation: fraudulent activity identified and independently prosecuted. No derogatory information attributable to subject. Captain Sorrell called me personally to tell me the file was clean, and there was something in her voice, not quite warmth because she isn't a warm woman by nature, but something adjacent to it, when she said, "For what it's worth, Commander, I've read a lot of next of kin files in my career. Yours is the first family I've ever had to explain your own rank to. It itself didn't survive the scandal unchanged, and I don't think it should have." My father, working with Rosalind on the civil side of things, restructured the Brackwaters ownership so that major financial decisions, loans, renovations, anything above modest threshold, now required fall from an independent advisor the family retained specifically for that purpose, rather than resting entirely on whichever sibling was most persuasive in a given year. It wasn't a punishment, exactly. It was an acknowledgement that a family running on unexamined trust had let that trust get exploited for a decade, and that the fix wasn't forgiveness or blame, but structure. Oversight. The kind of accountability that should have existed from the start. Isadora and Roman still live in town, though not at the inn anymore. I see her occasionally, at the grocery store or the post office, and we nodded each other the careful, wordless nod of two people who used to share a childhood and now mostly share a court record. I won't pretend there's some tidy reconciliation waiting at the end of this story. There isn't. What there is instead is something quieter and I think more honest. The simple fact that I no longer carry the weight of being underestimated by my own family. Because the truth of who I am doesn't require their belief to be real anymore. It never actually did. It just took a phone call from a woman I'd never met, delivering news I already knew about myself, to finally make everyone else catch up. My mother was the one who changed the plaque. But I found out about it the way I find out about most things at the Brackwater now. By walking through the front door on a visit home and noticing before anyone said a word. I stood in front of that board for a long time the first time I saw it, my collarbone long since healed, my next deployment already scheduled, and I thought about how strange it is that it took a stranger's phone call, a woman doing her job, following protocol, reading a decade-old contact number off a form to finally make my own family see something that had been true the entire time. Petty Officer Okafor came to the ceremony when Cormorant got underway again. Three months later, off crutches by then, grinning through the same brace and boot combination I remembered from my own recovery. He shook my hand on the pier, and when my mother, who had driven 6 hours to see the change of command properly this time, the first Navy event of my career she'd ever actually attended, asked him what it was like serving under me, he said something I've thought about often since. "She's the reason I still have both legs working right," he told her, with the easy bluntness of a 24-year-old who hasn't yet learned to soften things for an audience. Fractured her own collarbone, hauling me out of a flooding compartment, and didn't stop working until every one of us was accounted for. "Ma'am, respectfully, whatever they used to say about her back home, I don't know who was telling that story, but they didn't know your daughter at all." My mother didn't say much in response. She just nodded and reached out to shake his hand a second time, longer than the first, and I understood that this, a young sailor's unscripted honesty on a windswept pier, had done something in 30 seconds that 10 years of arguments never could have. The old board was still there, the same hand-lettered wood my great-grandfather had mounted in 1957, but the line that used to read Marlowe Kingsolver, away in service, had been sanded down and repainted, my mother's careful cursive replacing the vague, unfinished sentence that had sat there for a decade. It read, simply, "Commander Marlowe Kingsolver, United States Navy, Commanding Officer, USS Cormorant," no embellishment, no apology folded into the wording, though I think some part of my mother wanted to add one. Just the truth, stated plainly, in the same place it could have been stated all along if anyone had thought to ask. Respect was never actually owed to a title, or a plaque, or a phone call from a captain using the right rank in the right tone of voice. It was owed, all along, to the person standing quietly behind the door, doing the work, whether or not anyone in the room happened to be watching. I think about that every time I walk past that board now. Not with bitterness, mostly, but with a kind of settled clarity I didn't have a year ago. I didn't need the Navy to call home for me to be who I already was. I'd been that person the entire time. Through every deployment nobody asked about. Every promotion that arrived in an envelope nobody opened at the dinner table. Every quiet return home to a family that had already decided who I must be without ever checking. But I'm not going to pretend it didn't feel like something. Finally, hearing my own family say my rank out loud without flinching. My mother reading it off that board in her own handwriting. My father calling before he acts instead of assuming he already knows best. Even Isadora's careful, wordless nod across a grocery store aisle, which is its own small, complicated kind of honesty. None of it undoes what happened. None of it needed to. It just meant that for the first time in a decade, the story being told about me in that house finally matched the one that had been true all along. Sometimes, when Cormorant is underway and the watch is quiet, I think about that brass bell on the Brackwater's front door, and the plaque beside it, and how a family can go a full decade without ever once checking whether the stories they've settled on is the true one. I don't think my parents were cruel people. I don't think most families who let this happen are cruel, exactly. I think it's easier than anyone wants to admit, letting the loudest voice in the room write everyone else's history, right up until the day a stranger calls to correct the record. I got my correction. Not everyone does. That's the part of this I hope stays with you longer than anything else. If you've made it this far, you already know how this one ends. But if you want to see where a story like this goes when the family doesn't get a chance to rebuild anything at all, when nobody steps up the way my father eventually did, there's another one waiting for you right now, one of the most watched stories on this channel, and I think you're going to want to see how far it goes.